welcome to everybody here and online to our event on Delivering REPowerEU. The genesis of this event is kind of a twofold thing. On the one hand, we really wanted to have an update on how REPowerEU is going because it's of fundamental importance to the future of Europe's energy system. But it's kind of dropped out of the headlines a bit because of the IRA and the EU's response to that, and as gas prices have fallen too. And then the other part of the event that we want to do is to launch our exciting new reports, which everybody in the room should have, and hopefully a link to it will be posted in the chat. It's called Europe Needs Both Fiscal and Energy Solidarity, and Elisabetta Cornago, my colleague here, and I have tried hopefully to combine our skills reasonably well. It covers a kind of evaluation of what member states have done in terms of their policy responses to the energy crisis, what the EU has been up to, and then some thoughts about what the future might look like in terms of hastening getting off Russian gas and meeting the 2030 climate targets. So the structure of this is very rude because Elisabetta and I are going to speak first, and then our honoured guest Matthew is going to speak second. We're going to sort of lay out our paper, and then Matthew Baldwin, Deputy Director General for Energy, is going to discuss sort of more of the nitty-gritty about REPowerEU, what's been done, what's going to happen, what needs to be done, how brilliantly the European Commission and the member states have done, and hopefully maybe just respond to a couple of points in our paper, but we shall see. So we're each going to speak for about 7 minutes, and then we'll hand over to a discussion. Elisabetta is going to go first, then me, then Matthew. Elisabetta.
All right, thank you, John. Thank you, Matthew, for joining us in person today. Thank you all again for braving the weather. I guess what I'll try to do in these 7 or so minutes is to summarize a couple of key points from the paper we are launching today, and then make a couple of reflections on how to deliver on REPowerEU, as we've titled this event. So a bit looking forward and looking at how we've done in the past year and a half. So on our analysis, I think highlighting some of the key, I guess, facts and figures, I think the one number that we've probably already heard several times in recent months is that in the past 1.5 years, we've put collectively across Europe over 700 billion euros on emergency measures to shield consumers from the energy price spike. This is the amount that member states, as well as the UK and Norway all together, have earmarked for this purpose. So earmarking means not all of that may necessarily be spent, but still it's a rather sizable number if we're talking about an emergency temporary type of measure. And in this policy brief that we're presenting today, we focus on a handful of countries to go a bit more into the details of how exactly they have been handling this crisis. We look at Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Poland, so let's say the big hitters. We also look at a couple of countries where energy poverty is particularly severe, Bulgaria and Greece, and we also look at the UK. And so we've come through their emergency energy policies in the past year and a half to basically classify them according to their priority. So whether it's about cutting energy, spending costs, transport costs, supporting incomes, and also we've classified them according to the approach that policymakers have taken, whether that's price suppression measures, which, as the name says, it is about shielding consumers entirely or partially from the price signal, from the increasing prices, through price freezes, price caps, shields, a number of creative names, cutting excise taxes, and then other types of measures such as transfers that aim to preserve the consumption power of households while not muting the price signal and letting them then decide how to spend that money. And of course, there are a range of additional tools, from tax credits to support for utilities. What we show is that in these countries, in these member states, the governments have spent over 4 times more on these price control, price suppression measures, like, again, tax cuts, price freezes, than on cash transfers. And this is even though we know that generic transfers are actually better at preserving the income of consumers, and that's maintaining the incentive for saving energy throughout an energy crisis, something that REPowerEU has been putting a lot of attention on, right? We also show that about 1/3 only of the measures that have been implemented in the past year or so are targeted towards the households that need them the most, so towards lower income households that are at particular risk of energy poverty. And this means then, on the other hand, that probably a large chunk of the public money that has been poured into these measures may have gone to people that did not necessarily need all that help to pay their bills. And of course, while these may have been necessary to proceed quickly as prices were increasing, and to avoid damage again at the most vulnerable groups in the population, it's important now going forward to probably redirect a bit better these public funds and to make sure that they help out in the most generous ways those households that really need them the most. So what does then all this say about the way European governments are approaching the energy crunch, have been approaching rather the energy crunch, and how they're looking at the energy transition more broadly? I think it's not a surprise, if you look at charts, yes, indeed, fiscal space is very different across the union, surprise, surprise. And indeed, as I said, our analysis is based on allocated funding as opposed to verified spending. But with that caveat in mind, still, it's clear that a country like Germany has the potential to vastly outspend other major EU member states with its emergency support measures. And you can see how some large spenders like Germany and France have managed to support rather equally households and businesses, whereas smaller countries with smaller public budgets, such as Poland or Bulgaria, in their decisions, I think the trade-off between having to pretty much choose where to be most generous is more visible. Poland spends substantially more on household support. Bulgaria did the opposite, leaning more towards businesses. So another thing which I think is noteworthy is that the amounts of money that the governments have been allocating to emergency measures have not always been proportional to energy poverty figures, nor to the price increases. I mean, the rate of energy poverty in Germany is minimal compared to Bulgaria or Greece, for example. And again, of course, that's partly related then the generosity in earmarking all these funds linked to the need to speed response to the energy price spike, but also probably the difficulty in rolling back these measures once they are in place without triggering backlash from voters. So with this, I think I've highlighted what I wanted to focus our attention on from our paper. Maybe a couple of reflections on then moving forward. How do we deliver on REPowerEU? Focusing on energy efficiency, I'd say here in this reflection of mine, because one of the pillars of REPowerEU is the need to reduce energy demand through energy efficiency particularly. So it's even clearer, I think, to us after this very tense winter that we've been experiencing, that accelerating investment in efficiency in buildings and in industry, of course, is key for the energy transition, but for energy security, first and foremost. And I think it's important then to avoid this asymmetry in the fiscal space that we see behind the way in which these emergency measures have been put in place in the past year or so, translating into some member states being outnumbered, outpaced in investment in all the key assets that are crucial for the transition, from efficiency to grids and renewables. I think probably maybe, I don't know if it's a silver lining, but I think an element of hope is that, if we've made space for over 700 billion euros in energy subsidies, surely we can spare some for structural investment in improving energy efficiency in Europe. And what are the numbers on that? Back just before the pandemic, the Commission had estimated that throughout this decade, we would need an additional around 56 billion euros to be devoted to energy efficiency across the EU to meet basically the Green Deal target. So that's 56 billion across the EU in one decade. Compare that to the numbers we've just mentioned on energy subsidies. It seems peanuts, right, with respect to what we've just been discussing on an emergency measure. So we do need to turn around then, particularly high efficiency, deep renovation rates in Europe, boost industrial efficiency, continuing, I think, the momentum that has been triggered by this crisis. And we think, and then we try and state that with this paper, that this calls for a greater role of EU-level investment, which John will elaborate on, and the role that collective EU-level borrowing can play in advancing that. Maybe just one final point and sort of suggestion that I think it would be interesting to hear what you think about also, Matthew, is the EU has piloted, I guess, tested national level energy savings targets this past winter with success, I'd say, to ensure that everyone played their effort in avoiding shortages of gas and electricity. So should we be thinking about having something like that, national level targets on things like renovation rates, for example, to, again, keep the momentum and try and put a bit more responsibility on member states to shift from not only efficiency via behavior change and changes in industrial operations to the investment needed to make that more stable as opposed to a seasonal response. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Elisabetta. So Elisabetta took care of the microeconomics, and I'm going to do some macro. And I want to make 3 points really. One is just on the what we know about the macroeconomics of energy crises. 2 is to evaluate a bit the European collective response macroeconomically, and 3, say why the EU needs to do more. So on the macro, I mean, if you cast your mind back to 1973 and the OPEC response to the Yom Kippur War, where they effectively imposed an embargo on countries that were allies of Israel, this led to the infamous first energy price shock. We had huge fuel shortages and very rapid inflation. Even after the embargo ended, then oil prices were about 3 times higher than they had been before the Yom Kippur War. And it also led to a Western strategy of alliance with Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing countries in the Middle East, which obviously has reverberated in terms of historical developments since. Putin has been doing exactly the same thing, but he's been losing, thanks to the hard work that everybody's been putting in, including Matthew. Gas prices have come down off their peak. They're down to about 50 euros per megawatt hour now. But future markets say they're probably going to remain elevated and certainly higher than they were before the pandemic, which is the right time to score it by, I think. And that's going to continue for several years. We've pretty much avoided a recession, done a lot better than a lot of the most doom-laden predictions back in last summer and autumn. And we have alternatives to Russian gas, and that's something that I want to discuss in a second. And so, the repower strategy seems very sensible and quite different to the response to the 1973 shock, where it's like, we need to cut out Russian fossil fuel imports in general and reduce fossil fuel imports in general too. Let's not go back to a situation where we're dependent on a particular country or region for energy sources. So that's kind of by way of introduction. I mean, in terms of the macroeconomics of this is a classic terms of trade shock, which means that the price of your imports have gone up by far more than the price of your exports. And the EU's energy import prices have gone up hugely, and we don't have very much domestic source of supply. Our export prices haven't really gone up that much, and so we're inevitably poorer, and we have to dig into our consumption in order to be able to fund the purchases of gas, oil, coal imports that we need to make to keep the heat and light on. European Central Bank has raised interest rates in response, and high energy prices threaten European industrial competitiveness, I would say far more than US subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act do. But the difference between now and the 1970s is that we have the technology to be able to alleviate the terms of trade shock, right? We have mature technologies in the sense of renewables for energy generation, and we have mature technologies for reducing energy consumption, which Elisabetta just discussed, insulation, heat pumps, and so forth. So the classic response, I think, the best response that we can possibly make is to try and make investment to accelerate that shift from fossil fuel imports into other sources of supply. Obviously, the private sector is going to have to do most of that. Shifting to higher prices and phasing out consumer and business support is going to play a key part, because it raises the incentives to invest in energy efficiency and other forms of energy. Obviously, there's going to have to be permitting reform, and this is a big part of REPowerEU, permitting reform for renewables. But there is also a large role for public investment here. So one is obviously de-risking finance for renewables. Well, de-risking renewables is an important part of keeping the costs down, improving the electricity grid, and also subsidies for consumer efforts to try and electrify transport and heating, electric vehicles and heat pumps, and also to reduce energy consumption through insulation. And altogether, that's going to be pretty expensive. I mean, obviously, the attempts to try and work out the costs of this are quite tricky, but excellent paper recently by Claudio Bacchianti of Agri Energiewende, I think is worth reading, and he puts this as about 250 billion euros per year additional investments in the energy transition is required to meet the 2030 energy targets, emissions targets across the EU. And if we do this, then this is pretty much automatically going to raise growth, because we're resolving the terms of trade shock, we're importing fewer fossil fuels, particularly from Russia, improving our energy security, and everybody's better off. So that's kind of the macro. Let me just say a couple of words about what the collective EU financial response has been, both to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the energy price shock, and also under Next Generation EU. Elisabetta mentioned that the investment pulse that has come from after Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been much smaller than the amount of money that's been spent on price controls and other forms of subsidies for energy. But before the invasion, we also had Next Gen EU, right, where 37% of it was supposed to be invested in climate and energy through to 2026. Our calculations suggest that adds up to about, across the EU, about 24 billion a year across the EU 27 to 26 in terms of the collective funding by the EU for the energy transition. The remaining loans within Next Generation EU, which member states didn't take up, they are being offered as loans for REPowerEU, and there's about 250 billion in loans that is possible for member states to tap. The issue here is, because it's lending rather than grants, the subsidy that member states get depends on whether their borrowing costs are higher than the EU's collective cost of borrowing or not. So, if you're Germany or France, and your cost of borrowing is actually a little bit less than that of the EU 27 collectively, then there's no point in you taking the loans. For those countries whose borrowing costs are higher, then it makes sense. But that's the way that you calculate the subsidy. It's not the overall 250 billion that matters. It's how much extra do you get, how much subsidy do you get because your borrowing costs are different to that of the EU collectively. And we've done a kind of rough calculation of what that means. And it adds up to about 6 billion a year in subsidy to member states for delivering REPowerEU. And that's obviously not nothing. That's really helpful. And for some countries, particularly those that are really struggling with higher borrowing costs, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, although that's a tricky case, Poland, also a bit of a tricky case, then we're talking about somewhere between 0.2 and 0.4% of GDP in subsidy. So that, that's helpful. But in terms of it being a big acceleration, big boost of financing, it's not necessarily there. We're talking about, with Next Generation EU and the extra REPowerEU lending, we're talking about 30 billion a year. And if we go back to Claudio's estimate of the total additional public investment needs, we're talking about 250 billion a year. So it's not nothing, but it's not absolutely huge. And so to conclude, I just want to make 4 arguments for the EU doing more and financing more of this collectively. Argument number 1 is European security and reducing emissions are public goods. And the definition of a public good is, if the state doesn't intervene, the private sector won't deliver enough of it, right? And this is true of energy security and of emissions. So, let's say, to take an example, and I'm not accusing anyone here, but let's say Spain sees that France and Belgium are going to build an interconnector that allows France to have access to North Sea wind. Then Spain can say, oh, well, great, they're going to turn off some of their gas plants, and that will mean that gas prices are a bit lower and we can get a bit more. And a similar example could be Poland says, right, we're going to completely cut out Russian oil. But Greek shipping magnates say, oh, well, we're going to rebadge our tankers as a kind of non-aligned, under a non-aligned country's flag, and take advantage of our ability to be able to ship Russian crude elsewhere. And so there's always these risks of free riding, particularly when you have collective goods like energy security and emissions, which can really only be resolved, or are best resolved, by action at the centre, by action at the EU level. And so that's a good argument, I think, for solving the free rider problem by both planning an energy system, an integrated energy system at the EU level, and also providing finance for it. The second argument is that interest rates are on the rise. And that means that some more fiscally constrained member states may slow down on investment because they think, okay, I've got this difficult trade-off to make. Do I make big investments in the energy system, or do I protect pensions and health? And pensions and health are the things that are going to really determine my electoral chances. So perhaps I choose that instead. So using the EU's collective balance sheet to fund this resolves a lot of those issues. And it also means that the cost of borrowing is lower, the cost of financing the transition is lower, because you're not relying on fiscally strained member states to do all of the expenditure themselves, the borrowing and the expenditure and the financing themselves. Third argument for doing more is that if a new system is planned centrally, it's going to be more efficient, right? If we end up with lots of national energy systems, then you will have too many renewables. You could have a much more efficient system by having fewer larger renewables systems, which are interconnected, and where energy trading resolves some of the efficiency problems. So, northern wind and southern solar, for example, or east-west, the sun rises in the east earlier than it does in the west, and so you can use that to fund. Thank you. To help with Western electricity early in the morning. And if you plan something centrally, you should finance it centrally. And then a final point, then I'll hand over to Matthew. Sorry for going on so long. Is industrial competitiveness. The IRA response has the EU's response to the IRA has become incredibly topical. But I think subsidizing the manufacturing of green technology is not exactly on target for what the EU's competitiveness problem is, which is really higher energy costs. It will help, but it seems better to spend more scarce resources on build out of technology, on grids and on de-risking renewables and so forth, rather than subsidizing manufacturers that are going to be building the components of the system. And it will be interesting to have a discussion about whether that's right. My slightly neoclassical view, which may be wrong, is that if you create the demand, then producers will create the supply lines to build it. So we'll see if that's right. Okay, that's me. Sorry for talking for more than my allotted time, which is bad for the chair, for a host and a chair. Yeah. And let me pass over to Matthew, who's going to give us an update on REPowerEU. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for having me, Elisabetta, John, for your really interesting and excellent paper. I normally say at this point, commiserations to those people online, but in fact, congratulations for not coming through the rain. The slight mist you see in the room is steam from the excited participants. The slight smell of damp dog is from me. I quickly like to talk about how the EU's responded to the crisis in the short term. And I think, I don't want to prejudge it, I think we're now moving into the medium term aspect of the crisis and how we're doing there. And I think that leads me to try to address the questions you confront very well in the paper about, are we doing enough on energy efficiency and renewables? And then I just thought it'd be interesting at the end to say a little bit about, this rather overdone kind of battle between the EU and US, and, is our response this week going to be that, that battle lines are drawn? Spoiler alert, I'm going to conclude that battle is more in the minds of the press than in the minds of everyone else. So quickly, how have we done? Of course, as I joked earlier, we've done brilliantly well. I've only been at this for the last 6 months, and if you think I look old and haggard, imagine the people who've been at this since the start of the crisis, which is really October 21 feel. It was good that you went back to the 73 crisis, John, which I dimly remember, with the petrol coupons and the speed limits. I think this one swamps it in terms of, it's interesting to hear in terms of the overall macroeconomic and potentially the political effect. It has driven a really, we always say this, don't we, but a really unprecedented series of actions at the European level, driven by the European Council. I've lost count of the number of detailed discussions in the European Council, sometimes picked up in detail in the conclusion, sometimes not. And therefore driven again by our president, Ursula von der Leyen, who's taken a personal hand in this and established a team of commissioners addressing these issues, which is why you will see from different points. Kadri Simpson, Vice President Timmermans, Vice President Šefčovič has now come in to work on the joint purchasing issues. But everyone has a role to play. You kindly flagged the REPowerEU headline, and back to fundamentals. What do you need as a democratic society in establishing an energy policy? You need to ensure you've got the supplies, you need to ensure that they're affordable, and now you need also to ensure that they're sustainable. And many people have speculated this is an impossible triangle to meet, and in fact not. I hope REPower demonstrates that it's a necessary triangle and it can be met. And going back to pick up the first point from your paper that I wanted to address, which is, look, you're absolutely right that it would have been better, wouldn't it, if member states had scientifically addressed the investments that are needed and targeted any support measures on vulnerable households and saved a lot of money. But that would be, if I may just say on a personal basis, to ignore the politics of this whole thing, which is that member states and member state governments, you mentioned pension and health as alternative things, actually dealing with the energy prices shock has been fundamental for governments across the EU. And I don't think it's a question of them embarrassedly saying, yeah, we're chucking a load of money at this. They wanted their names on, this is what we've done to reduce your energy bills. And yes, I guess they wanted to do that for more than the most vulnerable. I'm not excusing it. I'm not justifying it. But I think it's just a reality that we have to deal with, and we have to make sure that then that doesn't lose. We don't lose the peace, if you like, in terms of the need for future investments. So back to repower, as you said, John, it was not just about getting out of Russian gas. It was ending dependency on Russian gas. We'd allowed ourselves to get absurdly dependent. It was about accelerating the green transition, particularly in energy efficiency or renewables, both through policy and funding, and I'll say more about that. It's about diversifying into other sources of gas. So we reduced this gap from the missing Russian gas by not just renewables, but in the short term, we had no alternative but to diversify into other sources of gas through this thing which I run called the Energy Platform, which is really about ensuring access for all member states and companies really to gas and on the best possible terms. So to that end, we're motoring forward now with joint purchase. We'll be doing the first tenders for demand, as part of our demand aggregation exercise through Aggregate EU, which will take place in mid-April. And we hope to see the first gas being purchased jointly to support the storage filling in mid-May. It's also been about optimizing our use of infrastructure, not just building new infrastructure, but ensuring the connections and ensuring it's used in the best way. And it's been about a massive international reach out to different countries, different suppliers. I'll come on to those, but just for example, the US have supplied massively increased amounts of LNG from 15 BCM equivalent in 2021 to 56 in 2022. Norway is now the largest pipeline supplier and has supplied record amounts of gas through its pipelines to Europe and has pledged to do so for the coming years as well. On top of these things, in again, this unprecedented year, there have been measures to address electricity peak demand back in September. And indeed, today, the next episode in the electricity story, which is the reform of the electricity market design proposed. Measures to reduce gas demand. It's not just, so I think that's a crucial pillar which governments have embraced as well as trying to reduce the costs of that gas. We set a target of 15% across the EU, and I'll come on to that. It's been largely met. And also storage filling, a very unglamorous subject, but everyone has become greatly expert. You know, politicians ask anxiously, what's the latest storage filling rate? And we set a target of 80% for 22, 90% for 23. And last but not least, we came after a long and agonized discussion with measures to address the risk of gas price spikes or shocks at the end of last year. And so how have we done? Storage filling, let's just look at that. At this stage in the winter of 2022, 1st of March, we were at 29% and we're currently at 56%. So we have come through the winter with full gas, rather full gas storages, which is not just been a good insurance policy for this winter, but it will already gives us a leg up for the next winter, which again, on the street, people are saying it's the winter of 23 to 24 that people are really worried about. Demand reduction from August of last year to January is going along at about 19%. Again, we've had both of these factors influenced by a milder winter than usual, by the absence of LNG events like we saw in previous years at Freeport in the US or Hammerhead in Norway. And the Russian gas supplies have continued to come in. So we haven't had, we've had a steady, limited flow of Russian gas. But these demand reduction actions themselves amount to a 42 BCM reduction, which is a little around 10% of our annual consumption. And for no surprise, therefore, we will propose to prolong that 15% demand reduction for the coming period. Gas infrastructure. Probably rightly criticized. We've done a lot after previous gas crises to address the problems. but not enough in terms of LNG infrastructure. And that has, I think, at least partly accounted for the higher prices we've seen in Europe. We've seen 25 BCM additional LNG capacity come on stream just in the course of the last year, 50 more predicted by the end of this year. So again, a step change. Every time I open a newspaper, the Germans support another floating storage and regasification unit. Prices you mentioned, John, are down at around 50, I agree, compared to, let's remember, more than 300 at their peak in August. But you also rightly reminded us that it's around twice the pre-war level, and there's still a lot of expensive subsidies, as you've all mentioned. What's happened to Russian gas? It's come down from representing 50% of our pipeline imports to around 9% of our pipeline imports. In BCM terms, it's down from 155 at the start of last year to 62 at the end of last year. Now it's down at about 40, 20 through the pipe, 20 through LNG. And 70 BCM of additional gas has come in from LNG, and Norway also paying a big contribution to that. I'll give you those figures. So summary, and sorry, this is a bit long as well. No complacency, that's the key word we are trying to avoid here. But we're in a position which I think is better than certainly the worst case scenarios, and I'd say better than most scenarios where we'd be at this stage in 2023. And it is, I think, a remarkable transformation. And we haven't, it's not really on my list of things to talk about today, but I think it does reflect a sea change in member states' willingness to address things rapidly at the European level through emergency legislation. It's passing things very quickly in a rather pragmatic way and really working hard at those issues. So to the medium term, and can we meet that other part of the balance between security and affordability and the energy transition? And I think your paper is a great contribution to the debate on this, and thank you very much for doing it. We've tried to set a self-consciously ambitious program in REPower to boost the sustainable part of the equation. And again, the numbers coming in are not bad. We saw a lot more electricity generated from wind power and solar. In fact, I think for the first time, 2022 saw more electricity coming from those sources than from gas, 39% in total from renewable sources. It was a record year for solar. We saw 41 gigawatts of new capacity installed. We saw 15 gigawatts of wind installed. But yep, more is needed. More is needed on energy efficiency. We propose to boost the energy efficiency rate from 9 to 13%. Stop press, the trilogues this week concluded on a figure of 11.7%. Yes, it was that sort of trilogue. I'd love to know how the cursor was found, but I wasn't in that particular trilogue. We need to close out the third edition of the Renewable Energy Directive with ambitious renewable targets in place. We propose to move from 40 to 45% by 2030. Might sound like a small change, but you need to see it against a backdrop of steadily incremental changes. And this would go beyond the Fit for 55 level of 40 to, as I said, 45. And we need to get a good result on that. We need a big push on things like biomethane, particularly on heat pumps. I'd just like to focus on. We set ambitious targets in REPower for that. We've seen a 38% increase in deployment of heat pumps in 22. 2.5 million heat pumps were sold last year in just 13 member states. I was in Poland last week, and there's been a huge enthusiastic response to heat pumps, and partly a sort of national patriotic action. I'm not going to get any more Russian gas. I'm going into my heat pumps. And just that number alone sold displaces 3.5 billion cubic meters of gas, and it is twice what we estimated we'd get in REPower. But again, no complacency. We need to go further. We need to go faster. I expect Commissioner Simpson to say to the Parliament this afternoon that we are going to develop further plans on this. And we need to push on large-scale offshore projects. We've got summit meetings, 2 planned to discuss offshore wind in Ostend on the 24th of April, later in the year in Lithuania. We need to push on the grid. There's a big focus, I'm glad to say, in the initial incipient discussions on the REPower plans with member states on how we can integrate renewables into the grid, which is a technical business, but it's also an investment business, and it needs to move forward fast. And then last but not least, how can we incentivize and boost renewables in the context of the reform of the electricity market design, again, adopted today, a big reform, which in headline, and have a look at the stuff yourselves, it should make consumer prices a lot less dependent on, consumer prices of electricity a lot less dependent on fossil fuel prices. It should drive in more incentives in low carbon and renewables. And we think it therefore credibilizes the target of 69% electricity generated from renewables by 2030. So the third part, as I promised, are we doing enough in terms of our investments? Again, your paper is very interesting on this. Part of the problem we face is that we've been pecking away at these targets, applying a lot of funds progressively over the years. I mean, let's remind ourselves, the recovery and resilience plans were already a once in a generation effort to drive the green as well as the digital transition. And what we're doing in REPowerEU, and I don't doubt there are many people out there, including in the energy world, who wish it had been more. It does, as you say, channel an additional 225 billion in loans and an additional 20 billion in grants. And what is interesting to me is we go to the member states. I was in Poland last week, Hungary a few weeks before. It's just how much interest there is in this in the REPower plans and trying to bring this to life. And the guidance we gave them, which is the principal focus should be about boosting renewables, boosting energy efficiency, the grid, but it also can be used for targeted investments for key security of supply where it's necessary in terms of gas infrastructure. The famous Annex 3, for those who are really nerdy who want to read in the REPower communication, we set out the vetted projects there. But let's not forget the other money that's been out there. There's the Connecting Europe facility, the CEF energy money. There's the Next Gen EU money. I mean, multiple hundreds of billions literally have been brought. You would all argue rightly that we need to sustain multiple hundreds of billions for the coming period. But I do urge you to remember what has happened in the past. And then later this week, so it can be another busy week on energy. I'm expecting to see the Commission to approve the Net Zero Industry Act. Also, I'll come back to actually that. We are in this Net Zero Industry Act looking to develop the clean energy technologies where we have a competitive edge. We're also looking to focus on those technologies, bearing in mind our gas experience, where we are over-dependent on single suppliers. And there's been a lot said, as I hinted at the start, about how we match up to what the Americans are doing. And I think sometimes we are not confident enough about our own situation in Europe. For those of you who like podcasts, other than the CR podcast, other than your excellent podcast, what was fascinating to me is the rest is history, talking about energy, access to energy as one of the long-term historical factors. And I've no doubt that that's true, but it was altogether too pessimistic because in Europe, we have an incredible potential on clean energy, an incredibly innovative and competitive industry from offshore wind to electrolyzers, partly because we've been pushing these issues a lot longer, and governments, regions, cities have been thinking about it and integrating these things for longer. So we should be confident. I expect to see, sorry for this terrible language, but Philip will know that the fastest way to a short career in the Commission is to speculate too much about Commission proposals before they're adopted on the record. But I do expect to see from various drafts that I think have been leaked that we'll see more on permitting, simpler, faster rules. Again, our third go at permitting. More about coordinated access to funding. So not just funding, but making sure that people can access it. And last but not least, skills for the green transition. And this is important. We could throw as much money as we like at things, or indeed renovation rates in cities. And if we don't have the people, we don't have the raw materials, the skills, we'll really struggle. Cities are really struggling to get their renovation rates up above 1%. And that's going to be crucial. As a foretaste for this, is it going to be a transatlantic battle? President von der Leyen was in Washington on Friday and agreed a statement with President Biden. And just to quote from that, Today, the United States and the Commission announced the launch of the Clean Energy Incentives Dialogue to coordinate our respective incentive programs so they are mutually reinforcing. Both sides will take steps to avoid disruptions in transatlantic trades and investment flows. We are working against zero-sum competition so that our incentives maximize clean energy deployment and jobs and do not lead to windfalls for private interests. So, I mean, yeah, it's a statement. It doesn't mean that's not going to happen, but this is where the leaders are putting their shoulders to the wheel, and I don't think it serves either of us. Last but not least, this is badly structured, but it's the final thing I want to say. Let's not forget hydrogen. Renewable hydrogen is a crucial part of what we're trying to achieve. So we set very ambitious plans for that in REPowerEU, 10 million tons of domestic production, 10 million tons of imported production. Sounds like a lot. It is in reality, if we achieve those ambitious targets, it is a bit less than 5% of our total gas consumption. So it's starting from a low base. It's got a long way to go. There will be a communication, we think, I believe, later this week on the hydrogen bank, which President von der Leyen flagged in her State of the Union speech back in September, essentially focusing on how we can cover the cost gap between renewable or green hydrogen and fossil hydrogen in the absence of a sufficient green market premium at the moment, and aiming to leverage the maximum possible private finance into subsidized projects. And this should benefit both European and international producers in terms of reducing the cost gap. It should help, this is pure economic speak for you, John, help early market formation by providing price and cost discovery. Again, I think you need to keep this in focus. It will complement the public funding resources for this, for developing production and use and infrastructure at the member state and the EU level, which already exists around 30 billion. So I grind in a not very dramatic way to a halt, but you've raised, as usual, in the CR the right issues, and you've raised them in a very fair and thought-provoking way, and I hope many people in the town read your paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That was a great overview of all of the efforts that have been made since before Putin's invasion, I guess. We're now going to open up to comments, questions, points that anyone would like to make. We've got about 45 minutes for that. If anybody online wants to ask a question, we kind of encourage people to use the microphone on their computers, and we have ways of doing that. So if you raise your hand, then my colleague will mute and unmute you. Well, unmute you and then mute you. So that you can ask your question. Alternatively, if you really don't want to do that, then you can just drop your point question in the chat. So yeah, got 45 minutes. Would anyone like to kick us off? If not, it will be me, and you've all had enough of me. Hi, yes, please. Could you just say who you are and where you're from? Also, please use the microphone. And
yes, hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Michele Grassi. I'm from Forefront. I have a couple of questions for Matthew regarding REPower. First of all, I was wondering whether you have already a bit of an idea what the priorities will be for member states, what the priorities will be for member states in terms of spending. And I think another big question from our side is whether REPower will deliver, whether REPowerEU will deliver quickly enough. We know that member states are having a lot of troubles getting the money out with the recovery fund. There have been a lot of severe delays in investments, and given all these bottlenecks that are already taking shape in member states, will REPowerEU deliver quick enough to make a substantial difference on the energy supply in Europe?
Sorry, if you've got others stacked up, we can do that?
Well, we've got. Why don't you take that one, and then we'll
Mhm.
go to Heather online, and then over to Philip.
I mean, so I always answer questions like this, the project you're working on, will it succeed? Referring back to a former commissioner of mine, Pascal Lamy, who used to say, no one asks Rod Laver whether he thinks he's going to win this state sim, doesn't it? I mean, Rod Laver. No one asks Rod Laver whether he thinks he's going to win the match while he's playing it, right? But I will try to say. The priorities differ, and it depends where they're coming from. I mean, I think your paper does a very interesting job of showing that, and I'm pleased that the money, such as it is in repower, is going to the places that need it most in Central, Southeast Europe for the most part. We need to recall that there was only agreement to the regulation at the end of last year. And so we're now in the process of rapidly developing with the member states in a very hands-on way their plans and giving them a steer. One of the steers we give them is it implementable in time? We have these very tight deadlines on the repowers to try to get it done by 2025, which is tomorrow in terms of spending money in the EU, we recognize. So one of the things we're asking is, can it deliver enough? And you're right to refer to the delays that there have been in getting it out. I must say, I am very impressed at the way that the member states are dealing with this. At, if you like, the sort of technocratic level of the member states, we've met really serious state secretaries, undersecretaries who grasping this issue and know the potential for it to deliver and to make a difference. So I'm my Rod Laver thing is relatively optimistic.
Okay, thanks very much. Right, we're going to go online now to Heather Graby. Heather, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We could hear you.
Great. Thank you. I have a question about hydrogen. So, Matthew, you were pointing to the hydrogen bank as the key way of reducing the green premium. And there is a lot of, I think, quite justified concern that there's a certain amount of hydrogen hype going on, because it's also a very convenient way of justifying building more pipelines and other forms of gas infrastructure under the claim that they will be hydrogen ready and therefore they are actually green. So how would you try to tackle that? How would you try to make sure that this isn't just a way of greenwashing, that new gas infrastructure, particularly if it's funded with public money, won't actually be simply prolonging the license to operate for natural gas rather than for hydrogen? And secondly, on hydrogen, how to make sure it's really green. There still isn't really an international standard. There has been one put forward as a voluntary standard by the Green Hydrogen Organization, who've come up with a pretty good definition of green hydrogen, but that isn't a legal definition. So how might the Commission work on making sure that green hydrogen is not slightly grey, slightly blue, or slightly pink? Thank you. And pink, by the way, is the most controversial part. So whether that you might not want to comment on that today, but just to flag that nuclear produced hydrogen is perhaps the most controversial issue at the moment. Thanks.
Someone has had a wonderful time of giving the different types of hydrogen colors, and I'd love to know who the person is. But yes, nuclear is pink for some reason, blue is gas, green is green. Yeah. So, shall I answer the question?
Yeah, please do. And Elisabetta, please do. And Elisabetta, you might have some points to make on the hydrogen issue as someone who. No, okay, all right, fine.
Well, I mean, thanks, Heather. Nice to hear you. Coming disembodied across the speakers here in the room. Look, I mean, you're right about the hype thing. Are we going to see a hydrogen bubble like we saw the South Sea bubble in the 18th century? I'm less worried, to be very honest with you, about a hype and more anxious to see it get going. It is going to be very difficult to get green hydrogen to market. We need to put real pressure on this, which is why we've come forward with the hydrogen bank. If we can't, and it comes to the second part of your question, if we can't begin to cover the cost gap which exists between renewable and fossil hydrogen, it will stay stuck on the ground. And the hydrogen bank really aims to make that difference. It'll be funded by the Innovation Fund and executed by the EU agency CINIA. It'll drive these auctions, which you think will incentivize hydrogen production in the EU. So I'm more worried about getting off the ground than I'm worried about the hype, although we always have to be careful. On the definitional question, I mean, there's an incredibly learned debate on this, which I have to confess I'm not following it probably as closely as I should. But you're right. One of the potential collapsing things of this would be that if what is billed as green hydrogen turns out not to be, so we need to get it right. Elisabetta, say something more intelligent and relevant.
No, I want to stay away from the hydrogen per se, but I'd like to say something perhaps about the funding, in that I find it interesting that we now are in front of a hydrogen bank, which is very much picking a specific funding box for a very specific set of technologies, as opposed to, I think, leveraging the various boxes of money that we have scattered across the union and the member states to do better at, I think, supporting the various technologies that we need for the transition, including energy efficiency, which, as you may have noticed, is my particular beef today, and not only. So yeah, I think it's just, I guess, a word of caution at putting all bets, or like substantive bets, on one technology, particularly, even though, I mean, I do understand the point you make at trying to narrow the price gap between the fossil and renewable hydrogen specifically. But
if I may, firstly, you're absolutely right on energy efficiency, and it remains, I think, too much the poor person of energy discourse. And reasons why I think are fascinating. To my mind, it's one of the problems is its inherent complexity, and from the headline level, and you go down, you know, not very far into the body of the subject, and it becomes extraordinarily technical and not very sexy for politicians, because it quickly becomes what I call the long wagging finger point. You know, you shall refurbish your houses, you shall do this or do that, and it's very tricky. I should also add that the wonderful acronym, the EPBD, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, has now got through the Parliament, so it is advancing, and it's a good illustration of how difficult a subject it is. Just on your point about picking, you know, your implicit point about picking technologies, I think this is reasonable, because I think when we look at our overall policy of electrifying the economy, in all senses of the word, but in this case, electrification of the economy, it is very clear that there will be a number of hard to electrify sectors. And there aren't, as the French would say, 36 possible solutions out there for those, and hydrogen is one of the first. As Heather said, it has to be renewable, so we've got to provoke that movement into the market to develop it. And there are risks in doing that, we recognize that, but if we sit back, nothing will happen.
Okay, great. I've got loads of questions.
Oh,
so we're going to start.
I'll be shorter.
No, it's fine. But we're going to start grouping them. So we're going to start off with Philip Lowe, and then we're going to go online to Katja Malifava, and then we'll come to Matt Hind. So Philip Lowe.
Thanks, and thank you, Matthew and Elisabetta and John, for your presentations. John and Elisabetta's paper emphasize energy solidarity and the achievements made, which is true in terms of targets, energy savings, etc., etc. I just wonder when we go further on to the issues of investments in infrastructure, whether in fact there's still a challenge of achieving solidarity on what should be the market design. Because, look, 18 months ago, Spain and Portugal broke ranks on gas caps. If you read the French press in the last 18 months, they also have been blaming the EU for the demise of EDF, and being nostalgic about national solidarity on energy. And thirdly, when you when you listen to some of our energy ministers inside the EU, I'm now Belgian, by the way, so I can say this. that they actually talk about national energy policy and exports and imports from their own countries, even though the rate of interconnection and the rate of trade is more than 25% in some cases. So there is a mismatch at the moment between, and this is a question I'm putting to Matthew in particular, do we see any progress in this area in terms of creating a cohesion on what the energy market in Europe should look like and what investments are necessary to make it work properly? 6 months ago, we couldn't even dream of the idea of more investment in interconnection between Spain and France. The reality is that there's a large amount of the LNG capacity in Europe is actually in the Iberian Peninsula. So how do we get things moving beyond simple targets to actually practical commitment to countries as important as France to a European-wide energy policy in the direction which is illustrated brilliantly by this paper, but still there are questions to be asked.
More a dream than a reality so far. Yes, indeed. Okay, next we're going to go to Katya Yafimova online. Katya, can you hear us?
Hello, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thanks. Thank you. Very interesting presentation. My question would be first to Matthew. I listened to Maroš Šefčovič's recent press remarks where the figure was suggested something about 20 BCM or just slightly above of aggregated demand that member states have agreed to aggregate demand. That's not just member states, but also 3 countries from the Energy Community Treaty, contracting parties. So clearly that number is not very high. And that's for a period over the next 3 years, if I understood correctly, whereas the mandatory aggregation requirement is 15 BCM just for this year alone. So to me, that kind of suggests limited enthusiasm on part of member states in the EU in particular, in aggregation, let alone in purchasing. And my question is, would you expect this to change? Would you expect this amount grow somehow? And if so, why? Before the auctions are launched? And also maybe a more general question to both of you, Elisabetta and Matthew. There is a host of sort of so-called emergency measures have been taken and made part of the EU acquis in the recent year and a few months. Do you expect those to stay for 1 more year, 2 more years? And if they stay sort of long and take root, would you expect them to sort of potentially change the fabric of the internal energy market, out of recognition to make it, potentially much less liberalized than it has been to date? Thank you.
Wonderful, great questions. And the first one in particular followed on from Philip's very well, I thought. Matt Hines.
Thanks, John, and thanks to all of you for a really fascinating presentations. So I've got a question to Matthew as to whether this is a European approach or an EU-only approach. And just to put that in context, over the course of 2022, I think 16% of the gas in Europe's energy gas storage came via the UK transmission system and the UK LNG terminals. The electricity interconnectors flipped last year from being mainly EU to GB to EU, primarily down to the French nuclear fleet problems. And I think that probably demonstrates the interdependence of the UK and the EU energy systems here. Supply chains are a big problem. And I mean, well, put it like this. I would like to agree with John that a classical approach to supply and demand, given that we have such tough targets, will produce the necessary investment in the supply chains. It's not immediately clear that's happened, and we've had very tough targets since kind of 2007 onwards, to be perfectly honest. But I was told recently of an example around cable, where if you asked me to build a new interconnection project, we'd have to build a new factory for the cable. And given the cumulative targets in the North Sea of 126 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, 300 plus in 2050, that seems to be a bit of an issue. But I guess my question is, if you're having clean energy incentive dialogues with the US, which I think is a very good idea and a very sensible way to maintain transatlantic unity, is there an opportunity to have a similar dialogue with the UK on this to maintain North Sea unity, as it were? Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Give Matthew a break. Elisabetta, do you want to take those ones that were directed at you? I have a point or two to make, but I can go after Matthew.
I mean, I think you do obviously point your finger to the issue that there's still a large gap between the idea of a unified European energy market and the actual infrastructure that makes it effectively efficient and workable. And I think that also the differences in price spikes that we have seen on gas across the union have made it even more visible how congestion on the network and the lack of sufficient interconnectors, are a limitation. So I think governments are probably more alert to the necessity to invest more in infrastructure than they were before the crisis. So I do think that with that sort of renewed understanding in mind, or rather, I think that renewed understanding should be prompting advances. And I think a bit that's where John was heading with his pointer to sort of efficient central planning of infrastructure investment, because it's a European public good. So you do need to go heavier on the coordination and the spending on these types of investments that need to be planned all together in order to avoid the underinvestment on something that otherwise is going to necessarily end up in free riding. Will energy emergency measures stay, and what does that mean again for energy policy in Europe? It depends, I think, because well, some governments already showed that they can't really afford going on as generously for much longer. The Italian government, for example, reduced the discount on fuel taxes, for example, recently with the Meloni government, because they're short on cash pretty much. Belgium also announced something similar, that they would be tuning down support for consumers. So I think we are now, 1.5 years into the emergency. I think governments are realizing that as energy prices are coming down, they need to find a balance between consumer protection, mindful of the fact that energy price levels are going to remain pre-war and indeed pre-pandemic levels for the next couple of years at least, if not three, 4 winters, and the fiscal burden that brings. And for that, I think the response is, and it's the right one, as you said, sort of continuing with these energy savings targets and continuing to put the spotlight on the necessity to, well, encourage consumers to do as much as they can on demand response and make that a bit more structural. So not just basically leveraging the behavioral response, but well, helping them with investments to make sure that you reduce demand and that puts down the pressure on prices.
Thanks very much. Matthew, do you want to come in?
Sure. Very good question. Very good questions, and I don't have definitive answers to any of them, proving how good they are. I mean, I think, Philip, you've seen so much water go under this bridge. We need, it is true, to ensure that we have an energy union in name, in reality as well as just in name. And kind of a slightly glib answer to your point is to refer back to the point about national politics and energy. It is unrealistic to expect member states and member state leaders to say, this is all, I'm putting all my chips into the European game and I'm not going to fight, quote unquote, fight my corner in the debate, even recognizing, as I'm sure they would do, in private at least, that this might lead to thoroughly suboptimal outcomes. I think some of the processes we have in play help arrive at those discussions. So, for example, the decision we took to list the infrastructure projects in the annex to REPower as these are the things that have been gone through by ENSOE or ENSOG, depending on what they are, and these are, validated. Meant that it was harder for people to run sort of national hobby horse ideas in the context of REPower. I'd also say that, on things like gas solidarity agreements, they remain on paper, but not in reality. I think I would never remember the number, but I think that because it's between neighboring countries, there should be somewhere between 40 and 50, I think. And I think we have 6 in place. And I think this reflects the difficulty of doing it, which is why we propose to make these mandatory. And if they're not done, then we'll have a sort of standard agreement come into place. Typically tricky question. It's a work in progress. And maybe I should say that there is a risk, if you like, that post-crisis, and as the beacon focus in the European Council moves off this, that we will tend to slip back into national habits, and we shouldn't as far as possible. And people should read your paper and realize why it's important. Katja, thank you for your points. You're very well informed. So I cannot resist you correcting one small point, which is that the requirement on member states is to aggregate gas to the equivalent of 15% of their storage filling obligations, which is about 13.5 BCM. But your general point is right. I'm actually quite pleased with the response from member states in terms of how much gas they're putting on the table, which is it's about 25 BCM now, as you say, for the next 3 years. And that's quite a good number. Now, let's remind ourselves, this isn't gas that is automatically then going to be compulsory or is going to necessarily be purchased. It's gas that the member states are required under the emergency regulation of last December to put that into the first tenders. We have a great company called Prisma, who are our service provider, and organizing what will be monthly tenders on different location points across the European Union. And we hope this will attract offers of supply at good prices, at good volumes, at good delivery locations, which will then end up in deals being consummated. I'm not trying to manage expectations here, but I mean, this is the first go we've had at joint purchasing of gas. We've decided to target it on the need to support the storage filling process. Most people seem to think that's a good idea. And there's been, I think, a good, if measured, response. I mean, you're probably right to talk about a lack of enthusiasm in the industry for the initiative. The industry, of course, like many other industries, say, look, we know what we're doing and we're getting on with it. And someone said what we're doing is actually sort of social midstreaming, i.e. doing the work that the big gas aggregating companies like Total and Eni and Equinor and Petronas all do. I mean, they shouldn't see us as a rival. They play a vital part in terms of managing the gas market. This is an attempt to bring new players into the game, smaller gas purchasing companies who are having to wrestle with the difficulties of bringing LNG shipments in, where previously they were getting Russian pipeline shipments. Also, perhaps gas-consuming companies, which have faced these eye-watering bills in the last year. Maybe there's a chance for them to buy gas differently in the future. So I don't think we're a threat to any part of the industry. We're not a tank on anyone's lawn. It's the first go at joint purchasing. I'm personally really very pleased with how far we've got so far. The proof will be in the pudding as to how it rolls out this year. Let's see. And, you know, last point, we've learned an incredible amount about how to organize this stuff. I mean, one of the big issues was, can companies coordinate together in competition terms, in terms of demand aggregation or indeed purchase? And we've had some really sensible, realistic discussion. And we've actually arrived at 2 models by which companies can coordinate, which might amuse you, Philip, in terms of your competition as well as your energy policy background, without needing ex post or ex ante approval by the competition authorities. It's pragmatic, it's practical, and it's aimed at trying to help the markets find their place during the course of this year. And it's with the market. I think that's another important point. We're not trying to say, out of the way, the Commission is here, we're taking over. Far from it. I agree with what you said, Elisabetta, on the emergency regulations. I think there were 3 or 4 last year, maybe 5. that were done under Article 122. To remind those of you that don't follow this stuff obsessively, this is an article of the treaty which enables temporary regulation, particularly in areas like energy, at times of emergency where solidarity is needed. I mean, whoever came up with that treaty article needs to be thanked profoundly, because it was perfectly met for the crisis we had last year. It doesn't involve the Parliament, which is a problem, I think, for the longer term. It does mean these things are time limited. On one area, I've already hinted that we're likely to be moving forward with continuation, which is in demand reduction. In the other areas, as Shu Onlai would say, it is too early to say. We will think further before deciding whether they need to be extended, or indeed a different legislative base is needed to keep them in place. And finally, Matt, a good provocative question: is it a European approach or an EU-only approach? And I will answer it provocatively by saying, of course, it's wider than the EU. We're involving Ukraine, we're involving Moldova, we're involving the Western Balkan countries in the form of the energy community. But that joke aside, even in some of the difficult moments we've had with the UK over the Brexit discussions in recent times, we've always maintained good working relationships at commissioner level. We've reviewed cooperation in the different areas, whether it's in sanctions, renewables, security of supply, where the UK has been an important gas supplier last year. Just last year, there was an MOU on offshore renewable cooperation signed in December. The UK is part of the North Sea Energy Cooperation Council, et cetera, et cetera. I think the focus of the work has been exactly on that, security of supply in the crisis. In one or two areas, such as electricity trading arrangements, the work is still ongoing, but it's technically very complex. And I think that's probably all I want to say. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Right, I've got 4 people on my list. If anyone wants to nab a quick, yeah, I've got you on my list. Anyone else wants to raise their hand, then please do. We haven't got that much time left, so if everybody can keep things fairly brief, I'd be very grateful. And we're going to go David Higgins, then Marcus Fisher, and Anthony Carey online, and then Errol Rizzo online. So
thank you, John. So David Higgins, worked for a company called International Paper. Despite the name, we're in the world of packaging. We're an energy intensive industry. And so my question comes more from the industrial perspective, where John, you made a play towards the end of your opening, saying that the EU needs to do more. The EU probably consolidation of powers, which means that you're going to have some form of budget, more money. And part of my question would really be then, so where's the money coming from? And if the eyes around the table start to look at industry, that industry has to do more. And again, from an energy intensive industry perspective, where points during July and August in several member states in Europe, we had to stop producing. We couldn't produce because of our energy bills. And then if I look at where you mentioned inflation, inflationary pressure on wage increases at the moment, if you talk about then the cost of borrowing, which has increased. So industry in Europe has its back to the wall right now. And I think it's maybe a debate for another day, but the IRA versus the EU's approach philosophically, which support mechanism of getting us towards a more sustainable climate is an interesting question, because there's 2 different ways of getting here the way we're doing it. And the EU at the moment is on a heavy regulatory approach. But fundamentally, though, somewhere the question in the back of our mind is, where's the money coming from? Unless there's some sort of money magic tree that we haven't come. There's only one winner in this, by the way. As a citizen, my bills are eye-watering still. So nothing trickles down. 0. And your report card says it was rather withering on how much is getting to the member states, and so much more is needed. In my mind, there seems to be only one real winner out of this, industry-wise, the oil majors, which have made eye-watering profits. And somewhere then in my mind, this thing just doesn't quite add up, is that if we're going to be asking either wider industry to provide more, because the governments, and Elisabetta was touching on, their pockets are empty at this stage, given all the crises they've gone through. Industry is up against the wall and trying to just stay operational. And yet there are some outliers who have had extraordinary profits. How do you square that circle?
Okay, thanks very much. Marcus?
Yeah, Marcus Fisher from Ørsted, a renewable energy company. I have a question on the support for clean energy manufacturing, where I believe there's sort of two purposes, perhaps. The one is the role of like increasing costs, so using some sort of support to decrease cost and ensure more security of supply, and also in renewables deployment, we can feel so that inflationary cost pressure that is, can be worked against to tilt business cases again and make investments into the big volumes of renewables we need. And I think easier regulatory frameworks such as accelerated permitting, etc., also for manufacturing sites are probably a good way forward. But I think John mentioned it's not really sure if it's the money best spent, if it would be sort of direct support, or if the money might be better spent in the development. But that to me is only like one side of it, with the role of the cost. The other one is, I think, focused around innovation and perhaps competitiveness. So European clean energy manufacturing, to my knowledge, is very innovative in the way it creates technologies, and is especially one of the leaders when it comes to coming up with new technologies, for example, on offshore wind or wind energy in general, like nature-friendly or nature-inclusive design or circularity, and perhaps some incentives could be given here, for example, through a more focus on sustainability in various tenders or which shape or form. But generally, my question is, how can you policy balance between, on the one hand side, the need for in clean energy manufacturing decreasing the cost so it can be deployed, but maybe on the other hand also then still enabling innovation and enabling European clean energy manufacturing to be also, for example, leading on circularity, on nature inclusive design and sustainability.
Hello. Hello.
Hello, can you hear me? Sorry, I forgot to put the microphone on. Anthony Carey, I just read your comment out. And Errol, would you like to go ahead?
Me? Hello?
We can hear you now, yeah.
Okay. Actually, my question is regarding access to funding. And a lot of us are now looking at ESG funds, not the dark green, which is under Article 9, but the light green under Article 8. Now, what we see in the US, because you did mention the US, John, the IRA attraction is the tax credit incentives, right? And there's a lot of investment taking place because of that. We need to have something similar in Europe for these ESG funds which are being set up, because if we're going to be looking at lending to SMEs, that's not going to really help. I mean, I think that there is a need for ESG funds to benefit under Article 8 from tax incentives, which the European Commission asks member states under the EU taxonomy to offer for green projects, whether they are renewables, whether they are brown to green, or whether they are for the EPB, the energy performance of buildings. Without much of incentives, I don't think at least the southern countries will see much investment going into the transition. And I would like to have Matthew's opinion on why the European Commission is not asking member states to offer tax incentives, like in the US.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left. We'll probably go on by a couple of minutes because there's a few questions to answer. I'm just going to say something quite brief about innovation, because it's come up a fair amount, both from Matt, from Dave, from Marcus, and to a certain extent from Errol. And Matt's point was that we haven't had the supply chain being built up despite having pretty strong targets from 2007. My first response to that is not because policy hasn't been credible. I mean, we've had quite rapid deployment in some sectors, and that's where the policy has been most credible. And in sectors where it's been less credible, or that have been less affected by the carbon price under the ETS, or that the carbon price hasn't been high enough to drive investment in those sectors, we haven't seen such a strong response. In terms of the innovation question, and I guess also saying a little bit towards Errol's point, in sort of classical textbook land, you subsidize where there is a market failure. There's a clear market failure in big new energy projects where, in order to be able to demonstrate that they work, you need to have scale. And so funding the demonstration projects makes a lot of sense. It's a good idea to fund quite basic research on new technology. And there's, at least in principle, a decent rationale for subsidizing to overcome consumer inertia, and to provide public goods that would not otherwise be, which would mean that the infrastructure needed would not necessarily be set up. But there's a pretty weak rationale for subsidizing manufacturers. Generally, in all sorts of areas, we see manufacturers scaling up in response to demand incentives further down the line. So that's why I would say, Errol, that I don't know if it's a sensible idea really to have member states give tax incentives to ESG funds that invest in equivalent companies to the IRA. It's better to use your marginal euro to overcome other sorts of market failure. Okay, Elisabetta and then Matthew.
I think quick point on building upon what David was saying on who's been making money basically out of the crisis at a time when everybody's been feeling the brunt of higher energy prices. And connecting to the question that Katja asked before, I wonder whether or how much longer will the measures on windfall profit extraction remain, and particularly whether they should be targeted even more so, perhaps even more aggressively at the oil and gas sector, considering, of course, the complications around where they are located, but in terms of the political difficulty of seeing the extra profits in those sectors and consumers still to a certain extent suffering from increased energy prices. I think one of the novelties of the EU's measures in the past year or so has been being a bit more creative in finding that cash, and I think that's been perhaps one of the good ideas around it on oil and gas, I would say, because then on windfall profits of the famous infra-marginal producers, one term that we have all learned to be sort of using.
Never going to be the same again.
Precisely. Then there's the whole discussion of whether there's investment on the renewable front. But yeah, so I guess that's perhaps one item of the EU level measures that may live on further. I think let me just.
Okay, Matthew.
I'll be trying to be really quick because I know we're nearly out of time. Thank you all for these really good questions and observations. David, you said a lot, and I have a lot I'd like to say in response. I firstly really just want to acknowledge, because of this massive net transfer between because of their energy prices, we know that energy consuming industries have been effectively in survival mode. And you've got out of things by postponing, by fuel switching, but we know there's been some demand destruction. We know it's been brutally tough. We are very committed to try to find ways to help, which is one of the motivations behind joint purchasing. And at some point, it'd be interesting to hear your views as to whether that is something that would interest you. You're right, Elisabetta, we are serious about windfall profits. I don't know whether we will maintain the proposals from last September. But if you speak to any of our commissioners, or Vice President Šefčovič the other day, he'll be very, very clear that whatever we do on joint purchasing, it is, we will be wanting to bear down hard on the windfall profits. It's not about more rent for the oil and gas industry. That's clear. I actually don't feel very well equipped to add anything to your answer to Marcus's very interesting point, but I think it's something I want to think about. And similarly, Errol, I'm going to be cowardly and I'm going to duck your question about tax incentives, mainly because, and I'm not trying to give you a heavy hint here either, but mainly because the Net Zero Industrial Act is still very much up for grabs and is to be published on Thursday, and I don't want to speculate about what will be in it, which leaves me nuclear. There's a long answer and the short answer. The short answer is that it's for member states to decide on the energy mixes, and the number are choosing nuclear, and some have chosen nuclear and moved away, and some others are thinking about moving back. What I think is interesting is the renaissance of interest in the potential for nuclear, both from the demand side for that in terms of what it can deliver of the energy transition, but also because of technological innovation. We are keen to try to respect technology neutrality. I think you'll see that reflected in the EMD, the electricity market design proposals today. There are two things which I think are quite interesting and relevant from the current discussion. Firstly is the issue of the security of fuel supply for the nuclear industry, which is, again, very much under the spotlight. And secondly, to sort of try to assess and where appropriate promote the competitiveness of these new things called SMRs, small modular reactors, and to try to encourage the emergence of a European supply chain there. So I think this is something interesting to follow and to follow up. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks very much to all of you for coming and for all of your questions. We'll wrap up there. But first of all, just a really big thank you to Matthew for coming and for giving us so much of his time. It was such a busy day as well.